Hey guys, welcome to our Ask Founders series. My name is Nilojana and I'm a trainee solicitor here at Dragon Argent. Today we have invited Blair Spowart, who is co-founder of Seedling. A net zero target is a public commitment to reduce emissions by at least 90% by 2050. That's where Seedling come in, and they make it easy for businesses to reduce their CO2 emissions, take a positive environmental action and transition towards a net zero. In today's episode, we discuss what an environmental, social and governance ESG is and what its benefits are, and how your business can become a certified carbon neutral business to attract investors. So let's not wait any longer, let's dive right in. Well, thanks for joining us, Blair. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about your experience before becoming a co-founder of Seedling?
Yeah, so before I founded Seedling, I worked for CIL Management Consultants, which is a strategy consultancy based in the UK, but they've got offices internationally now. And what they do is they work with private equity firms basically to help them assess the commercials of businesses that they're looking at investing in. So what's the market size, what's the competitive landscape, things like that. So I joined CIL straight after uni as an analyst. And over the course of four to 5 years, I worked on upwards of kind of 50 projects. So that was really good experience, and a good kind of basis for what I'm doing now, in that worked across lots of different industries, saw lots of different business models. A lot of it was kind of B2B tech, which is directly relevant to what I'm doing. So really useful to see directly examples of businesses that were founded often within the past 5 to 10 years and have grown really quickly and done really well and established themselves as kind of scaled mid-market businesses. And just seeing, I guess, a bit of a playbook around what worked and what didn't for a lot of those businesses. I think having that basis was quite useful in terms of just helping frame what we were going to do with Seedling. Yeah.
Nice. So can you just tell me a little bit more about what Seedling do? Yeah,
so Seedling is a carbon accounting platform. So we help SMEs mainly to measure, reduce and offset their emissions. So we do that mainly through our SaaS platform, but we also kind of support our clients alongside and throughout the process. So if they have any questions around the data that they need to gather for the footprint, support with things like reduction advice that's specific to them, and really just any questions around how they how they manage and how they communicate what they're doing on sustainability. It's not a kind of self-serve platform. We're there to help throughout the process. So
how do you help them measure the
footprint? So the footprinting process is probably the main chunk of work.
Okay.
So what we do is we take data from across the business from quite a wide range of different sources. So we look at what the business has spent with their suppliers in different industries. We look at things like the energy usage of the business if they have office premises, so things like their energy usage of electricity, gas. We look at air conditioning systems. We look at things like employee commuting, business travel. It's really quite extensive in terms of the different sources of emissions that a business can have, going from I suppose what's most easily controllable for them and most immediate, which everybody kind of thinks of as being within the kind of physical premises that the business operates within, so the office in most cases, kind of right through to what employees do, so with things like commuting and travel. In terms of the kind of difficulties and challenges that businesses can face, particularly SMEs, they don't always have the kind of ideal data to hand.
Right.
So a good example of that is an SME that maybe occupies kind of a co-working space or is in a kind of managed rent situation. Often they don't actually have access to their electricity bills, so they don't have a kind of immediate and clear idea around how much energy they're using, and that makes it quite difficult to estimate their emissions. So what we can do in the meantime is we can kind of be flexible and look at, for example, the amount of office space that they occupy. That can help us get to an estimate. But that kind of thing is quite a big challenge, particularly for SMEs, and a lot of the time it's difficult for them to engage with their landlord, for example, and try to get more accurate information. So yeah, it's really just about working with the business and seeing what data they have, explaining what's ideal, and then if they don't have the ideal data set, then kind of finding ways around that.
Why is it so important that businesses consider their carbon footprint?
Yeah, well, I think so. Obviously, from an overall climate change point of view, it's really come to the fore in terms of the public imagination. So it's really important to do just in terms of doing the right thing. So within the UK, 50% of corporate emissions are driven by SMEs. So although each SME is quite small in terms of the overall picture, if all SMEs start kind of bringing in the right policies and thinking about this, then it can make a real difference. And I think also from a kind of market or commercial point of view, it's really coming to the fore now as well. So maybe 5-10 years ago, it was kind of driven by very early pioneers, so kind of early adopters, people who were founders that were really interested in sustainability and just wanted to take their business down that route from the point of view of it being a kind of passion of theirs. But I think so. It was quite a small market and a nascent market, and I think now there are a lot more external pressures on SMEs to report. So this kind of happens for most of our clients, and the reason they come to us is because, and this is happening more and more, is often because, for example, they are bidding for public sector contracts, and it's really common nowadays, if you're addressing the public sector, that you'll be asked what your footprint is and what you're doing to reduce it, which isn't something that happened very often 5 years ago. Similarly, if you're serving like large private businesses, so most of them will have a net zero sustainability strategy in place, and that will include supplier engagement. So a lot of our clients, for the first time, have had kind of large corporate clients for years, and for the first time, they're being asked to report on a compulsory basis what their footprint is. So for an SME, it's really important to do, just from a kind of overall climate change mitigation point of view, but also commercially, it's becoming a lot more important.
Do you mind just telling me a little bit more about what a net zero strategy is?
Yeah, so I think so on net zero, it's probably important to make a distinction between net zero and carbon neutral.
Okay, yeah.
So net zero is really about making a long-term commitment to emission reduction. So basically with net zero, what has happened over the past few years is that some very clever people have worked out by what percentage do businesses need to reduce their emissions from the current point in order to stay in line with the global drive to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees.
Okay.
So that goal has been kind of government policy for quite a while now.
Right.
And so what net zero means is that a business is on that pathway. If you make a net zero commitment, it means that you have committed as an organisation to reducing your emissions by at least 90% by 2050 at the very latest. Right. So it's a very long-term kind of ambitious commitment to emission reduction. And that covers all your emissions. So it's your own kind of operational emissions, so office energy, vehicular emissions if you have fleet, but also across your supply chain and all the stakeholders within that. So it's really comprehensive and really ambitious and very long term. Whereas carbon neutral can happen now as a business. So what carbon neutral means is, as a business, you've measured your footprint, and then you've offset your emissions by at least 100%. Okay. So offsetting is where a business invests in projects that generate a reduction or removal of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. So yeah, carbon neutral means that you've measured your footprint and you've invested in those projects to the point where your emissions have theoretically balanced out. So we always kind of treat that as a bonus. So the important thing is kind of to realise that net zero is kind of the long-term ambition for measurement and reduction, and that should be the priority for any business, because you're taking responsibility for your own emissions and looking to reduce your own impact. But then offsetting can be really powerful as well. So there are lots of projects around the world that just wouldn't have happened without offsetting finance. It's a really easy way for businesses to have an impact in the here and now, particularly if their emissions are quite kind of difficult to influence or intractable. So we kind of recommend looking at both net zero and carbon neutral in tandem.
How does Seedling come into companies, businesses, SMEs wanting to be sort of carbon neutral or offsetting their carbon footprint?
Yeah, in terms of our process.
Yes.
So our process is SaaS driven. So when we onboard a client, we bring them onto our platform, and the first step is to complete their carbon footprint. Yeah. So that's done through our application. So the client will go onto our platform and input all the data that we need to measure their footprint, and there's kind of a guided assessment process where we take them through. We see what data they've got. Again, going back to my other point, see what data they have that is ideal, and if they don't have the ideal data, then how can we get around that? So we take them through that process. It doesn't take too long, really, to gather all that information. Usually about half a day of work on both sides. And then when we have all that data, we kind of check it and make sure that it's in line, that there aren't any gaps. And then our carbon accounting engine converts that data into carbon emissions. And so at that point, we produce their footprint, and they can see their emissions in quite granular detail. Then after that, we help them with reduction. So we look at a client's footprint and see where the hotspots are. Okay. And that's really the first kind of step, is seeing what are the top 10 sources of emissions and what can be done about them. So really from the off, kind of trying to be as ambitious as possible. So then we work with the client to see what kind of changes they can make. Often there'll be kind of a range of small changes that they can make, and sometimes there's maybe one or two big things that can make a big difference, although maybe more difficult to implement. So yeah, it's all kind of bespoke to the client and what their footprint is, where the hotspots are, and as a business, what can they realistically do about it. So when they have the reduction plan in place, then we look at offsetting. So that's an optional part of the process, but if that's the route that they want to go down, then we facilitate that as well. And then probably the final step is helping them to communicate what they've done. So when they've measured, reduced and offset their footprint, how do they communicate that to stakeholders that are interested? So their employees, their clients, investors, for example. There's a lot of focus nowadays on greenwashing. So
what's greenwashing?
So greenwashing is where a business makes so a business is greenwashing if it makes environmental claims which aren't substantiated or which are misleading. Right. So there have been some quite high-profile scandals with big companies that have kind of fallen foul of that. So there's a lot more focus and scrutiny on green claims nowadays, and often it just comes down to knowing the terminology and not saying you're doing something that is just patently kind of unsubstantiated or false, and just being as transparent as possible. So we, because sustainability, some of the terminology can be quite confusing sometimes. We help the client to kind of stay on the right side of that. So we know that they've done good work through our process, so we just help them kind of frame what they've done in the right way. So do you think this is a key point for SMEs looking for investments? Yeah, I think so. So I mean, overall, globally, ESG investing is a big trend, and it's gonna continue to be a big trend. So I think investors come at it from a couple of angles. So there are some investment funds that are just focused on green investments, and even funds that actually look to make acquisitions in in green sectors, so green tech, for example. But that's kind of bleeding out into the overall investment landscape. So probably a majority now of investors at least consider ESG and sustainability within the due diligence process, and in terms of the reporting that they require from their portfolio companies. It kind of depends on the stage of investment, I think. So if you're earlier stage, there's probably nothing in terms of requirement at the moment. But certainly as you kind of go through investment stages and become later stage, a lot of businesses are starting to see requirements from investors. Sometimes it's not requirements, sometimes it's just kind of a gentle push towards sustainability initiatives. But certainly as you get to kind of the mid-market, like private equity level, there's a lot more kind of mandatory reporting to the fund. And I think that's driven by a few things. Partly it's just driven by investors seeing that it's good to future-proof businesses and make sure that they have a sustainability agenda in place in case it comes up in the ways that I've mentioned. So, for example, being asked by clients, supporting recruitment and retention of employees, and points like that. So,
what are the key areas that businesses can make adjustments or changes to lower their carbon footprint?
Yeah, so it really depends on the kind of the type of emissions. So touching on a couple of the sources that I've mentioned. So if you look at office energy use, there's not like one big thing that you can do a lot of the time to be more energy efficient. It's kind of a tick list of maybe a top 10 or a top 20, which all taken together can actually aggregate and become quite significant. So it's really simple things like having a no standby policy, making sure that the lights are switched off when you leave the building, checking things like insulation to make sure the heating isn't on, the heat doesn't escape unnecessarily. So there's a whole raft of kind of small measures like that which can add up to make a difference. But often in terms of a business's overall footprint, it isn't the kind of the immediate kind of controllable emissions which make a big difference. It tends to be within the supply chain. Right. Okay. So that's the kind of the products and services that the business is buying, and that's particularly true for like service-based businesses or office-based businesses. Because really an individual office, while there are changes you can make in the grand scheme of things, isn't particularly high emitting. Whereas, for example, if you just look at kind of a common part of a service business supply chain, which is IT equipment. If you think about the supply chain of IT kits, so everything from like the mining of raw materials to create the structure of the kit and the batteries and everything else, like processing at factory, distribution. If you think about everything that occurs across a supply chain, you can see how that would, if you're purchasing a lot of IT equipment, add up to a lot more in terms of your footprint compared to an office. So it's within the supply chain that there tends to be kind of the highest emissions, but also in many ways like the most difficult to influence. Okay. Yeah. Because if you're a business and you're hiring lots of new people, you just need more IT equipment. So that can be quite tricky to measure and quite tricky to reduce, but often there are a few things that you can do. So taking IT equipment as an example, so one of the main things you can do is see about sourcing refurbished kit. Okay, now it's not that easy to find, but where it's possible, that can make a big difference to your footprint, because in that case you're only really accounting for the kind of repair and maintenance of the equipment instead of all the kind of new production and processing that I ran through. So it's not always the case that there's something that a business can practically do, but where there is something like that that can make a big difference, then we can kind of help clients find their way to it.
Do you believe? What do you think is hindering businesses to actually sort of look into their carbon footprint and tackle it?
Well, I think for SMEs, unless there's kind of an immediate trigger, like for example, an important client has asked for it, it's often something that It's often something that they'll want to do and they want to be on the agenda, but because as an SME you don't have someone, you don't have the resource to kind of put somebody on this full time as a sustainability lead, it often becomes a lower priority for businesses particularly when they're busy. There's a lot going on, so that can be quite challenging. It's just, first of all, as a business, just taking the first step and putting resource towards just getting started with an environmental strategy. And then I think kind of past that, when you have actually decided to kind of bite the bullet and do your first footprint, I think there are just challenges around things like, if you're going to do it yourself, just knowing where to start and doing it properly. So that's why businesses like Seedling exist, because we kind of have the right processes and everything else in place to make sure it's kind of done properly and easily. And yeah, I think it's kind of the time burden that goes towards it. So that's something that we're really focused on. So we, our platform is designed to be really easy for SMEs as they're going through the process. Being flexible to the data that they have and making sure that it's robust but streamlined. So that's probably one of the main things. Yeah.
What do you think are the common issues companies face when they have to implement all these policies?
I think sometimes there's a clear way of reducing carbon that it just costs more.
Okay.
So I mean, just to give you a very obvious example, if you've got companies that are taking flights to Europe, for example, the obvious way of making a difference is to look at the Eurostar and see if you can use the train. Yeah. And some companies do that. As policy, they kind of offer it as an option to employees, even though it's obviously going to be more expensive, and for the employee it's going to be more time. Yeah. So there's often that often comes up where there's kind of an obvious way of reducing emissions, but it's either impractical or just costs too much. Yeah. And I think particularly at the moment, given the kind of economic environment, businesses aren't necessarily willing to pay a lot more to reduce their footprint. But sometimes that's not the case. So sometimes there's a good alignment between emission reduction and actually cost reduction. So energy efficiency is a good example. So if you're a business that pays your electricity and gas bill, then obviously improving the energy efficiency of your space is going to make a difference to the bottom line as well. So it's nice where there's alignment between those two things. Then it works really well. But yeah, unfortunately there isn't always, and a business just has to make a decision between carbon reduction and some other factor like cost or practicality, or commercial positioning, something like that. Yeah, so those can come into conflict.
What are the upcoming ESG policies in the UK, EU, and the US?
Yeah, so overall, globally, there's a real shift in terms of ESG reporting. So particularly in the EU and UK, there's a lot of new regulation that's coming in around kind of mandatory reporting of ESG metrics, and carbon footprints always kind of a core part of that. So in the EU, you've got the CSRD regulation, which is coming in, and there has been regulation in the EU in the past, but it's kind of broadening in scope under CSRD, so that any business that's over 250 employees, more or less, there are some other conditions, will have to report their entire footprint, so both their kind of their operations and across their value chain. So it's quite extensive. The UK isn't quite as extensive yet, but it is kind of catching up. So we have SECR in the UK, and that's been around for a while. So that's kind of similar in terms of the parameters. So more or less every business over 250 employees has to report kind of limited footprint information, and information on energy use. So those regulations kind of apply to larger businesses, but there are others that do kind of, if not directly affect smaller SMEs, they do kind of trickle down and affect them. So A good example is PPN 0621. So that's that is kind of rules around public sector procurement.
Right.
So at the moment, any contract with the public sector over, I think, 6 million in value, the bidder has to have a carbon footprint and carbon reduction plan.
Okay.
So that's again another regulation which tends to apply to larger businesses that are bidding on larger contracts in the UK. But the way the kind of public sector procurement works is a buyer will often kind of see a list of suppliers, and it's very prominent now if a supplier has compliance with that regulation. So if they have a carbon reduction plan. So a lot of kind of smaller businesses are finding that although that rule doesn't directly apply to them, they are kind of under competitive pressure within the public sector kind of bidding context to put together a carbon reduction plan.
Right.
So that's an example of how there's regulation that applies to larger contracts, larger businesses, but there's a trickle down effect in terms of pressure on SMEs. So another example with CSRD in the EU. So like I said, that will mandate reporting on a business's supply chain. So although it kind of directly applies to larger businesses, all of their smaller SME suppliers will now be being asked to report to the larger business because they form part of the larger business's footprint. So yeah, there's real kind of trickle down effect where regulation applies mainly to the larger businesses, but ends up leading to kind of not mandated, but certainly kind of reporting that's almost mandated in the sense that it would be silly from a commercial point of view not to kind of engage with it, if that makes sense.
What does the future look like for Seedling?
Yeah, so we're growing really quickly at the moment. We're going through our first funding round, so hoping to close that in the next couple of months. And yeah, then we'll be looking to hire some more people, and hopefully grow further in this year and see what comes after that.
Well, perfect. Thank you for that, Blair, and thank you for your time and for sharing what Seedling does with us.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for inviting me in. It's been great. Thanks.
Okay. We hope you liked today's episode. We have provided the contact details for Seedling in the description below if you need their help in getting carbon neutral certificate for your business and save the environment. And don't forget to subscribe and hit like for this episode.